My husband and his brother bet on how long I'd last scrubbing their cars in the snow. 10 minutes before she cries, my husband laughed. Neighbors gathered to watch. I kept scrubbing, smiled, and made a mental note of every witness to their cruelty. The sound of Clark's laughter cut through the February air like a rusty blade. I was standing in our driveway, groceries still scattered at my feet where I'd dropped them moments before, staring at the keys Ian had just thrown at my chest. They hit with enough force to sting, then clattered onto the frozen pavement beside a carton of eggs that had split open, yolk already freezing into yellow crystals on the concrete. I said, "Get to it," Ian repeated, his breath forming angry white clouds as he gestured toward the 2 pickup trucks parked side by side. Both vehicles were caked in 3 days' worth of road salt and brown slush from the storm that had dumped 8 inches of snow across our small Ohio town. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees overnight, and my fingers were already going numb just from the brief walk from the car to our front door. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that no one should endure humiliation in silence and that every woman deserves dignity in her own home, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. Clark, Ian's younger brother who'd been staying with us since his divorce became final, pulled a crumpled $10 bill from his jacket pocket and waved it like a flag of conquest. "This should be entertaining," he said, settling back against our porch railing with the casual confidence of someone about to watch a free show. $10 says she cries before 10 minutes are up. Ian's response was immediate and brutal. His laugh wasn't the warm sound I'd fallen in love with 23 years ago when we were both young and stupid and thought love could conquer anything. This laugh was sharp, calculated, designed to cut. 10 minutes? Clark, you're being generous. Look at her, already shivering, and she hasn't even started yet. 5 minutes, tops, before the waterworks begin. The worst part wasn't the bet itself. It was the way they were talking about me, like I wasn't standing right there, like I was some kind of entertainment they'd ordered for their Sunday morning amusement. Clark pulled out his phone and made a show of setting a timer. "This is going on social media," he announced. "Brothers predict wife's breakdown in real time." I bent down to retrieve the keys, my knees protesting as they hit the frozen ground. The metal was so cold it burned against my palm. As I stood back up, I caught sight of movement in my peripheral vision. Mrs. Patterson from next door had appeared on her front porch, coffee mug steaming in her hands like a prop in some twisted theater production. She was trying to look casual, but her eyes were fixed on our driveway with the intensity of someone watching a car accident unfold. "Morning, Helen," she called out with forced cheerfulness, her voice carrying that particular tone women use when they're pretending not to notice domestic drama playing out in broad daylight. The Johnsons from across the street emerged next, bundled in matching winter coats and making an elaborate show of checking their mailbox, despite the fact that no mail was delivered on Sundays. Janet Johnson kept glancing our way while her husband Bob shuffled through what was obviously yesterday's mail, both of them positioning themselves for the perfect view of whatever was about to unfold. Even teenage Jake Morrison from down the block had stopped his bike at the end of our driveway, one foot planted on the ground while he balanced on the pedal, his breath forming small puffs of vapor as he watched with the fascination only teenagers possess for adult dysfunction. "Looks like we've got an audience," Clark observed with obvious satisfaction. He raised his voice just enough to ensure the gathering neighbors could hear every word. "Helen's about to show us how tough she really is. Aren't you, Helen?" I walked toward Ian's truck first, a massive black Ford F-150 that he'd bought 3 months ago without consulting me, adding another $400 to our monthly expenses we couldn't afford. The bucket of soapy water I'd prepared earlier that morning sat beside the garage, steam rising from its surface in the frigid air. I dipped the sponge in and immediately felt the warmth leach out through my bare hands. "You forgot your gloves," Ian called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "But I guess tough girls don't need gloves, right?" I could have gone inside to get gloves. I could have told them both to wash their own vehicles. I could have thrown the keys back at Ian's face and walked away. Instead, I knelt down on the frozen concrete beside the truck's front bumper and began scrubbing away the accumulated grime and salt. The cold hit me like a physical assault. The wet sponge seemed to absorb every bit of warmth from my hands within seconds, and the soapy water running down my arms felt like ice needles against my skin. But as the discomfort intensified, something strange began happening inside my head. The hurt and humiliation I'd expected to feel were there, but underneath them was something else entirely. A growing sense of clarity that felt almost detached from the physical misery of the moment. "Timer's running," Clark announced, holding up his phone so everyone could see the glowing numbers counting down. 8 minutes and 30 seconds left before she breaks. Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably on her porch, and I caught her eye for just a moment. The expression on her face was one I'd never seen before, a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been shame. She looked away quickly, suddenly finding her coffee mug extremely interesting. I moved methodically around Ian's truck, scrubbing each panel with deliberate care. The physical pain in my hands was becoming intense, a burning, aching sensation that shot up my arms with every movement. But instead of crying, I found myself cataloging details with a precision that surprised me. Janet Johnson kept checking her watch and whispering to her husband. Mrs. Patterson had moved closer to her window, clearly torn between wanting to watch and wanting to retreat inside where she wouldn't have to witness whatever this was. Young Jake Morrison was the most honest of all my observers. He stared openly, his mouth slightly agape, probably wondering if adults always acted this strangely on Sunday mornings in suburbia. 5 minutes down, Clark called out cheerfully. "Looking a little red-eyed there, Helen. Ready to admit defeat." I wasn't red-eyed from tears. The cold wind was making my eyes water, but that was different. I paused in my scrubbing just long enough to look directly at him and smile. Not the forced, polite smile I'd been wearing for years, but something new. Something that made Clark's confident expression falter just slightly. "Just getting warmed up," I said, and the steadiness of my own voice surprised me. Ian's truck was nearly clean when I moved on to Clark's smaller red pickup. This one was even worse. Apparently he'd driven through every muddy backroad in the county during the storm, and the vehicle was coated in a layer of frozen grime that required serious scrubbing to remove. My hands were beyond numb now, moving almost independently of conscious thought, but that strange clarity in my mind was becoming stronger with each passing minute. "Timer's at 2 minutes, Clark announced, but his voice had lost some of its earlier enthusiasm. "She's actually going to do it, isn't she?" "Don't count your chickens," Ian replied, but he sounded less certain than before. "She's stubborn when she wants to be." Stubborn. 23 years of marriage, and that's how he described me to his brother while I knelt in the freezing cold, washing their vehicles like some kind of servant. Not strong, not determined, not even foolish. Stubborn. Like a mule that refused to move when beaten. The final minutes passed in a blur of repetitive motion and growing internal transformation. I finished Clark's truck with 30 seconds to spare on his arbitrary timer, then stood up slowly, every joint in my body protesting the extended time spent kneeling on frozen concrete. My hands were white and waxy looking, barely capable of gripping the dirty sponge. "Well, I'll be," Clark said, genuinely surprised as he looked at his phone. 10 minutes and she didn't shed a single tear. The gathered neighbors began dispersing, the show apparently over. Mrs. Patterson retreated inside without another word. The Johnsons finally headed back to their house, their mailbox exploration complete. Jake Morrison pedaled away, probably eager to tell his friends about the weird lady who washed trucks in the snow without crying. But I wasn't done cataloging. As each neighbor disappeared, I made mental notes. Who had watched with obvious discomfort? Who had seemed entertained? Who had looked away when things became too awkward to witness? These weren't just random observations. They felt important somehow, though I couldn't yet articulate why. Ian came down from the porch, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might actually apologize, might acknowledge that what had just happened crossed some invisible line we'd never discussed but had always understood. Instead he picked up the bucket of dirty water and dumped it into the storm drain. "Not bad," he said as if he were commenting on the weather. "Though you missed a spot on my tailgate." Clark was already heading inside, counting his $10 with exaggerated disappointment. "Easy come easy go," he muttered. "Thought she'd break faster than that." I stood there for several long moments after they'd both gone inside, my hands slowly regaining sensation in painful, prickling waves. The trucks gleamed in the weak February sunlight, cleaner than they'd been in months. The evidence of what had just happened was already disappearing. The puddles of dirty water would freeze and be swept away by the next storm. The scattered groceries could be cleaned up. The physical discomfort would fade. But something else had changed that wouldn't be so easily erased. As I finally gathered up the split eggs and torn grocery bags, I realized that the woman who had started washing those trucks 10 minutes ago was not the same woman who had finished the job. The transformation wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was quiet, internal, fundamental. I had smiled through their cruelty not because I was strong, but because I was learning something important about the nature of power and humiliation and the long game of marriage. They thought they had broken me down, made me smaller, proven some point about hierarchy and control. They had no idea what they had actually done. Walking toward the house, my hands still burning with returning circulation, I realized I wasn't thinking about forgiveness or confrontation or any of the usual responses to marital cruelty. I was thinking about consequences. About the difference between immediate reaction and long-term strategy. About the fact that people who enjoy humiliating others in public have usually made themselves vulnerable in ways they don't even recognize. The bet was over, but the game was just beginning. And unlike Ian and Clark, I understood that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who smile while they're being underestimated. Walking into the warmth of our kitchen, I could hear Ian and Clark's voices carrying from the living room, already recounting their morning entertainment to someone on speakerphone. Ian's cousin Mike, from the sound of it, getting a blow-by-blow account of how they'd tested Helen's limits and discovered she was tougher than expected. Should have seen her face when I threw those keys, Ian was saying, punctuating his words with the familiar sound of a beer can opening. It wasn't even noon yet. Looked like a deer in headlights for a second there. Clark's laughter followed. The best part was when she actually smiled at the end. Like she enjoyed being put in her place or something. I set the salvaged groceries on the counter with deliberate quietness, each item placed with the careful precision of someone who had learned to move through their own house like a ghost. The carton of eggs was a total loss, but I'd managed to save most everything else. Waste bothered Ian more than cruelty ever would. The conversation in the living room continued, and I found myself listening with a different kind of attention than I'd ever paid before. Not the hurt, anxious monitoring I'd done for years, waiting for my name to come up, dreading the moment I'd become the topic of ridicule. This was something else entirely. Clinical. Methodical. Like studying a specimen under a microscope. Helen's got her uses, Ian was explaining to Mike. Keeps the house running, handles all the bills, never complains about working overtime to cover my poker nights. But she's gotten a little too comfortable lately, you know? Sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge. The casual way he said it, like I was a pet that needed occasional discipline, made something crystallize in my chest. This wasn't the first time I'd overheard conversations like this, but it was the first time I'd listened without the accompanying knot of shame and self-doubt that usually came with Ian's public assessments of my worth. Clark chimed in with his own observations. She's been different since I moved in. Plus, accommodating. Remember how she used to apologize for everything? Now she just stares at you when you correct her. Yeah, I noticed that too, Ian agreed. Think she's going through one of those phases women get. Probably needs more structure, more clear boundaries. I continued unpacking groceries, my movements automatic while my mind catalogued this conversation alongside every other small humiliation I'd absorbed over the years. The dinner parties where Ian would interrupt my stories to correct details that didn't need correcting. The way he'd publicly second-guess my grocery choices, my driving, my clothes, my opinions on everything from politics to the weather. The phone conversation ended and I heard Clark ask, "So what's the plan for today?" "Game starts at 1. Helen can make us some of those stuffed peppers," Ian replied. "And keep the beers coming. It's the least she can do after making us wait around in the cold this morning." Making them wait. As if I'd been the one who'd orchestrated the entire degrading spectacle. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the contents, remembering suddenly how this particular dynamic had developed. It hadn't started with public humiliation and cruel bets. It had begun with smaller things, gentle corrections that had gradually become less gentle, suggestions that had become commands, jokes at my expense that had become the standard way Ian interacted with me in social settings. The pattern had been so gradual I'd barely noticed it happening. When we were dating, Ian had loved my independence, my quick wit, the way I could hold my own in any conversation. But somewhere along the way, maybe after the first few years of marriage, maybe after his promotion at the county office gave him a taste of authority he'd never had before, my independence had become something that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. The worst part was how I'd enabled it. Every time I'd chosen peace over confrontation, Every time I'd absorbed his criticism without pushing back, every time I'd laughed along with jokes that weren't actually funny, I'd been teaching him that this behavior was acceptable. More than acceptable, rewarded. But Ian hadn't created this dynamic alone. Clark's return to town 6 months ago had accelerated everything, turned what had been private dysfunction into public performance art. The brothers fed off each other's worst instincts, each one trying to prove something to the other about masculinity and control and the proper way to handle women who'd gotten too comfortable. I pulled out the ingredients for stuffed peppers, then paused. In the drawer beside the stove, underneath the usual collection of takeout menus and expired coupons, was a manila folder I'd been avoiding for weeks. Our financial records. The ones Ian had asked me to organize and file, claiming he was too busy to handle such mundane tasks. What he didn't know was that I'd been doing more than just filing. I'd been reading, studying, discovering things that painted a very different picture of our marriage than the one Ian presented to his friends and family. The truck titles, for instance. Both vehicles were registered in my name alone. Something I'd never agreed to, never signed for, never even known about until I'd found the paperwork buried in a stack of other documents Ian had asked me to take care of. My signature was on the registration forms, but it wasn't my handwriting. The forgery was obvious once you knew to look for it, but who would think to look? Then there were the credit card applications. 7 different cards, all opened in the last 2 years, all in my name, all with my forged signature. The debt was staggering. Over $30,000 I'd never spent, never even known existed. Ian had been using my spotless credit rating as his personal piggy bank, funding his poker games, his bar tabs, his impulsive purchases. The loan applications were the worst discovery. A second mortgage on our house, a personal loan for $15,000, even a payday advance that was eating us alive with interest charges. All of it in my name, all of it forged, all of it making me legally responsible for debt I'd never incurred. Helen. Ian's voice called from the living room. Where are those beers? Coming, I called back, closing the financial folder and slipping it back into the drawer. But my hand lingered on the manila edge for just a moment longer than necessary. Evidence. That's what this was. Evidence of systematic financial abuse that could destroy Ian's life if it ever came to light. I carried 2 cold beers into the living room, where Ian and Clark had arranged themselves on the couch like kings holding court. The coffee table was already cluttered with their phones, Clark's wallet, a deck of cards, and the crumpled $10 bill from this morning's bet. Finally, Ian said, accepting his beer without looking at me. And we're going to need snacks. Chips, maybe some of that cheese and crackers thing you do. Of course, I replied, but something in my tone must have caught his attention because he looked up sharply. Problem? He asked, his voice carrying that edge of warning I'd learned to recognize over the years. No problem, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Just wondering if there's anything else you need. Clark laughed. Careful, Ian. She's got that look again. The one that says she's thinking too much. Women and thinking, Ian replied, shaking his head in mock despair. Dangerous combination. They both found this hilarious, but I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. Ian's laugh was just a little too loud, a little too forced. Clark's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something performative about their casual cruelty, something that suggested they were working harder to maintain this dynamic than they'd ever admit. I returned to the kitchen and began preparing their snacks, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the difference between reactive and proactive approaches to problem solving. About the way Ian had trained me to focus on managing his moods rather than questioning his behavior. About how 23 years of marriage had taught me to be an expert at reading his emotional weather patterns while completely ignoring the systematic way he'd been undermining my financial independence. The stuffed peppers went into the oven, the cheese and crackers were arranged on a platter, and I delivered everything to the living room with the efficiency of someone who'd been performing these tasks for decades. But as I moved through these familiar motions, I was also cataloging information with the same precision I'd used to study our neighbors that morning. Ian's habits, his weaknesses, his assumptions about my compliance and ignorance, the way he'd made himself vulnerable by committing fraud in my name, by creating a paper trail that could destroy his reputation and his career if anyone ever bothered to investigate. Clark's dependencies, his reliance on Ian for housing, for money, for social connection. The way his own recent divorce had left him bitter and looking for targets to blame for his failures. The financial records hidden in my kitchen drawer. The neighbors who'd witnessed this morning's humiliation. The growing awareness that I'd been playing defense in a game where offense was not only possible but overdue. People like Ian don't respond to confrontation or tears, I realized. They respond to consequences. And after 23 years of marriage, I was uniquely positioned to deliver exactly the kind of consequences that would matter most. The game was about to change, and Ian had no idea how thoroughly he'd armed his opponent. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For 3 weeks after the truck washing incident, I continued my usual routines. Cooking, cleaning, managing finances, absorbing Ian and Clark's casual cruelty with the same resigned silence I'd perfected over the years. But underneath that familiar surface, something entirely different was taking shape. I began studying Clark with the methodical attention of a scientist observing a lab specimen. His patterns became predictable after just a few days of careful watching. Monday nights at Murphy's bar, usually home by midnight, stumbling and loud. Tuesday evenings nursing beers on our couch while complaining about his ex-wife's lawyer. Wednesday through Friday, a rotating schedule of local establishments where he'd drink away whatever money Ian had loaned him that week. But it was Thursday nights that offered the most interesting data. Ian's weekly poker game at the American Legion Hall meant I was alone with Clark from 7 until well past midnight. And Clark, freed from his brother's judgmental presence, drank with the dedicated focus of someone trying to erase specific memories. "You know what your problem is, Helen?" he'd said one particular Thursday, bourbon making his words thick and philosophical. He was sprawled across our leather couch, his jacket thrown carelessly over the armrest, keys glinting from the front pocket. "You think too much. Women who think too much make themselves miserable." I'd been folding laundry at the kitchen table, maintaining the perfect image of domestic compliance while internally cataloging every detail of his inebriated state. "Is that so?" I'd replied mildly. "Absolutely. Take my ex-wife. Sarah was always thinking, always analyzing, always trying to figure out what I was really thinking. Drove herself crazy with it." He took another long pull from his glass. "You're starting to get that same look. That suspicious, calculating look that says you're planning something." If only he'd known how right he was. Clark's driving was legendarily reckless even when sober, but alcohol transformed him into something genuinely dangerous. He bragged constantly about his ability to navigate the rural back roads around our town at speeds that would terrify most people. "Cops never patrol out there," he'd boast. "I could drive those curves blindfolded." The irony wasn't lost on me that Clark's greatest source of pride would become the foundation of his downfall. The opportunity I'd been unconsciously waiting for arrived on a Thursday evening in March. Ian had left for his poker game with his usual collection of warnings about keeping Clark under control and making sure he didn't get into the good whiskey. Clark had responded by immediately heading for the good whiskey. By 9:30 he was unconscious on the couch, snoring with the deep rhythmic breathing of someone who wouldn't wake up if the house caught fire. His keys had slipped from his jacket pocket and lay on the floor beside a glass that still held 2 fingers of Ian's expensive bourbon. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, listening to the reliable pattern of his breathing. The garage was empty. Ian had taken his truck to poker night, claiming Clark's vehicle rode like a covered wagon and wasn't suitable for a man of his status. 3 hours. That's how long Ian's poker games typically lasted. Sometimes longer if he was winning. 3 hours of uninterrupted access to Clark's truck, with Clark himself providing the perfect alibi by being unconscious in our living room. I'd never sabotaged a vehicle before, but 23 years of marriage to a man who considered himself mechanically gifted had taught me more about automotive maintenance than I'd ever wanted to know. Ian's Saturday afternoons were always spent tinkering under the hood of one vehicle or another, usually with a beer in one hand and a wrench in the other, explaining every procedure to me whether I'd asked or not. The brake system was simpler than I'd expected. Not the dramatic movie-style cutting of brake lines that would result in immediate catastrophic failure, but something far more subtle and infinitely more plausible. A few loosened connections here, some fluid drained there, just enough to create delayed response time at high speeds, especially on the kind of winding back roads Clark loved to race down after a night of drinking. Working in the dim light of the garage, wearing Ian's old work gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, I made the kind of careful adjustments that would pass casual inspection but fail under the stress of aggressive driving. Nothing that would harm Clark seriously. I wasn't a murderer, despite what Ian's behavior sometimes made me fantasize about. But enough to cause an accident significant enough to bring investigators, insurance adjusters, and all the scrutiny that comes with suspicious vehicle malfunctions. The most interesting discovery came entirely by accident. While returning Clark's keys to his jacket pocket, I felt the crinkle of paper and found myself holding a manila envelope that had been folded and stuffed into the inner pocket. Curiosity got the better of discretion and I carefully extracted the contents. Life insurance paperwork. A substantial policy, $200,000, that Clark had apparently taken out shortly after his divorce became final. But the really intriguing detail was the beneficiary information. Not his ex-wife, not his parents, not even a charity. Ian's name was typed clearly on the beneficiary line, with a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Only family I have left." I photographed every page with my phone, hands trembling slightly as I realized the implications. Then I carefully refolded everything and returned it to Clark's pocket exactly as I'd found it. The insurance policy changed everything. What had started as a vague plan for causing Clark some inconvenience had suddenly become something far more sophisticated. With Ian as the primary beneficiary of a substantial life insurance policy, any accident involving Clark would automatically cast suspicion on my husband. Especially if there was evidence of vehicle tampering. Which brought me to the final piece of the puzzle, Ian's work gloves. He'd left them in the garage after his last automotive project, stained with grease and brake fluid from working on his own truck the previous weekend. I'd used them during my sabotage work specifically because they already contained traces of automotive fluids, making them perfect for hiding additional evidence. After completing my work on Clark's brakes, I sealed the gloves in a plastic bag and buried them deep in Ian's toolbox, underneath months of accumulated junk, old receipts, broken tools, spare parts for projects he'd never finished. The kind of hiding place that would be discovered eventually by someone looking hard enough, but would appear to be Ian's clumsy attempt at concealing evidence. Every element was falling into place with a precision that surprised me. Clark's reckless driving habits, Ian's mechanical knowledge, the insurance policy that created perfect motive, the physical evidence that would point directly at my husband. All I had to do was wait for Clark to provide the final component, an accident serious enough to trigger an investigation. Returning to the house, I found Clark exactly as I'd left him, still unconscious on the couch. I covered him with a blanket and cleaned up his whiskey glass, erasing any evidence that I'd been anywhere other than the kitchen, doing the kind of domestic tasks Ian expected me to be occupied with during his absences. When Ian returned from poker night 3 hours later, slightly drunk himself and in a good mood from winning $40, he found me reading in bed and Clark snoring peacefully on the couch. "How was he tonight?" Ian asked, loosening his tie with the satisfied air of a man whose evening had gone exactly as planned. "Quiet," I replied, not looking up from my book. "Fell asleep watching television around 9. Good. Maybe he's finally learning to pace himself." If Ian had known that his brother was now driving a vehicle with compromised brakes, or that evidence linking Ian himself to potential sabotage was hidden in his own toolbox, or that he was the primary beneficiary of an insurance policy that would make him the prime suspect in any accident involving Clark, he might have been less satisfied with how the evening had gone. But Ian had always underestimated me. He saw compliance where there was calculation, submission where there was strategy. And that fundamental misunderstanding was about to become the foundation of his destruction. The pieces were in place. Now all I had to do was wait for Clark to drive himself into the trap I'd so carefully constructed. I was folding Ian's shirts when the phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on that Tuesday in late March. The caller ID showed Mercy General Hospital, and for one terrible moment, I wondered if I'd miscalculated, if my careful sabotage had been more devastating than intended. "Mrs. Davidson? This is Nurse Kelly from Mercy General. Your brother-in-law Clark Davidson has been in an accident. He's conscious and stable, but he's asking for family." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I had to sit down on the edge of our bed. How badly is he hurt?" "Broken ribs, possible concussion, some lacerations from the glass. The doctor wants to keep him overnight for observation, but he should be fine." The truck took the worst of it. Ian was already reaching for his jacket before I'd even hung up the phone. "I'll drive," he said, his face pale with genuine concern. For all their toxic dynamics, the brothers did care about each other in their own dysfunctional way. The emergency room at Mercy General smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Clark looked smaller than usual in the hospital bed, his face marked with angry red scratches and his left arm in a sling. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw Ian, his expression immediately hardened. "About time you showed up," Clark said, his voice hoarse but strong enough to carry accusation. "I came as soon as Helen called," Ian replied, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "What the hell happened out there?" Clark's gaze shifted between Ian and me, something calculating flickering behind his pain medication-dulled eyes. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "Brakes just failed. Right there on that curve by Miller's farm. You know, the one where you always said someone was going to get themselves killed someday." The casual way he said it made Ian flinch visibly. "Christ, Clark. You're lucky to be alive. That curve's taken out 3 cars in the last 5 years." "Yeah. Lucky." Clark's tone suggested he didn't feel particularly fortunate. Officer Martinez seemed real interested in the brake failure. "Said they don't usually just fail like that on a truck that's only 2 years old." I watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone monitoring a chemistry experiment. The tension between the brothers was palpable, but it wasn't the usual competitive banter they typically engaged in. This was something darker, more suspicious. A uniformed police officer appeared in the doorway, young, Hispanic, with the kind of methodical manner that suggested he took his job seriously. "Mr. Davidson? I'm Officer Martinez. I responded to your accident tonight. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Clark nodded, but his eyes never left Ian's face. "Ask away. Can you walk me through what happened? Starting from when you left Murphy's bar." "Left around 10:30, maybe 10:45. Wasn't drunk if that's what you're thinking. Had 3 beers over 4 hours. I know my limits." Clark shifted painfully in the bed. "Took Highway 9 toward home like I always do. Hit that curve by Miller's place, touched the brakes to slow down for the turn and nothing. Pedal went straight to the floor." Officer Martinez made notes on a small pad. "Had you noticed any problems with the brakes lately? Any unusual sounds, grinding, pulling to one side?" "Nothing. Truck was running fine." Clark's gaze sharpened as it fixed on Ian again. "Course, Ian here's always telling me I should get better about maintenance. Always offering to take a look under the hood, you know? Real helpful brother." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Ian's face went through several rapid changes: confusion, hurt, and then a dawning awareness that he was somehow being implicated in his brother's accident. "Now wait just a minute," Ian started, but Officer Martinez held up a hand. "We'll need to have the vehicle inspected, of course. Standard procedure for any accident involving mechanical failure. Truck's already been towed to Peterson's garage. Should have preliminary results in a day or 2. I spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. "Officer, surely you don't think someone would deliberately? I mean, who would do such a thing?" Martinez glanced at me, then back at Clark. "Ma'am, we investigate all possibilities. Brake failure can happen naturally, but it can also be caused by tampering. We'll know more once the mechanic takes a look." The next 48 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Ian spent most of the time pacing around our house, alternating between worry about Clark's condition and growing anxiety about the police investigation. He called Peterson's garage twice on Wednesday, demanding updates that weren't available yet. "They're treating this like a crime scene," he complained to me Wednesday evening. "Acting like someone deliberately tried to hurt Clark. It's ridiculous." "Maybe they have to investigate everything these days," I replied, not looking up from the dinner I was preparing. "Liability issues, insurance requirements. I'm sure it's just routine." But I could see the doubt creeping into Ian's confidence. The casual arrogance that usually characterized his interactions with authority figures was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. The call came Thursday afternoon while Ian was at work. Peterson's garage had found evidence of tampering, loosened brake line connections and drained fluid that couldn't be explained by normal wear or accident damage. The case was being turned over to Detective Morrison from the Criminal Investigation Division. I relayed this information to Ian when he came home, watching carefully as the color drained from his face. "This is insane," he said, sinking into his recliner with the heavy movement of a man carrying unexpected weight. "Who would want to hurt Clark? And why are they looking at this like it's attempted murder? Maybe because someone tried to murder him, I suggested quietly. Ian's head snapped up. You can't be serious. Clark doesn't have enemies. Hell, nobody even takes him seriously enough to hate him properly. But I could see him thinking, processing, starting to understand that this investigation was going to dig into every aspect of Clark's life. And by extension his own. The poker games, the money he'd been lending Clark, the constant complaints about his brother's financial dependence. Detective Morrison arrived Friday morning, a middle-aged woman with gray-streaked hair and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested she'd heard every lie people could invent. She interviewed Ian first, asking detailed questions about his relationship with Clark, their recent interactions and his knowledge of automotive maintenance. When she spoke with me, I was careful to present myself as the concerned sister-in-law who'd noticed increasing tension between the brothers but had hoped it would resolve itself. Ian's been under a lot of stress lately, I told her, wringing my hands in what I hoped looked like genuine anxiety. Money troubles, you know. And Clark staying with us has been challenging. Ian keeps joking that Clark's worth more as an insurance payout than as a house guest, but I never thought he meant anything by it. Detective Morrison's pen moved steadily across her notepad. He's made comments like that before? Oh, not seriously. At least I don't think seriously. But lately. I let my voice trail off, then added quickly, but Ian would never actually hurt anyone. He's not that kind of person. The doubt in my voice was perfect. Just enough to plant seeds without seeming deliberately accusatory. By Friday evening, the investigation had shifted into a different gear entirely. Detective Morrison had obtained a search warrant for our garage, and Ian watched in growing horror as they methodically went through his tools, his workbench, every piece of automotive equipment he owned. When they found the plastic bag containing his work gloves, still stained with brake fluid and bearing his fingerprints, Ian's confusion transformed into something that looked remarkably like guilt to everyone watching. I don't understand, he kept saying as they bagged the gloves as evidence. I don't understand how this is happening. But Clark understood perfectly. When Detective Morrison showed him the evidence they'd collected, his suspicion crystallized into certainty. 20 years of brotherhood shattered in that moment, replaced by the terrible knowledge that his own brother had tried to kill him for insurance money. The beautiful thing about a well-constructed frame is that it doesn't require elaborate lies or complex deceptions. It simply arranges the truth in such a way that only one conclusion seems reasonable. And watching Ian's world collapse under the weight of circumstantial evidence that pointed directly at him, I finally understood what justice could look like when you stopped waiting for someone else to deliver it. The phone call from Ian's supervisor came Monday morning at 8:15, just as I was pouring coffee into my favorite blue mug, the one Ian had always claimed was too fancy for everyday use. County Administrator Patricia Williams spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone delivering unpleasant news she'd rather avoid. Mrs. Davidson, I'm calling to inform you that Ian has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Given the ongoing criminal investigation, the county feels it's necessary to distance itself from any potential liability. I thanked her politely and hung up, then sat at our kitchen table listening to the silence that followed. 20 years of steady employment, gone with a single phone call. 20 years of Ian strutting around town with the self-importance that came from being a county employee, from having what he considered a position of authority and respect. When Ian came downstairs an hour later, still in his bathrobe, I delivered the news with the same neutral tone Patricia Williams had used with me. They can't do this, he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. I haven't been convicted of anything. Hell, I haven't even been formally charged yet. Apparently they can, I replied, buttering toast with methodical precision. Administrative leave pending investigation. Standard policy. Ian sank into his chair across from me, suddenly looking older than his 51 years. This is destroying everything, Helen. My job, my reputation, my relationship with Clark. All based on some circumstantial evidence that doesn't prove anything. I studied his face over the rim of my coffee cup. The arrogance that had defined him for so long was cracking, revealing something desperate and frightened underneath. Maybe you should call your lawyer. The lawyer, Tom Bradley, a local attorney who specialized in criminal defense, had news that made Ian's employment situation seem trivial by comparison. When Ian returned from their Tuesday morning meeting, his face was ashen. They found more, he said, collapsing into his recliner with the defeated posture of a man who'd run out of fight. Bradley went through our financial records as part of building my defense. Found all those forged signatures, the hidden debt, the credit cards and loans I took out in your name. I continued folding laundry, each movement deliberate and calm. What does that mean for your case? It means the prosecution now has a clear motive for attempted murder. They're saying I needed Clark's insurance money to cover the debt I'd been hiding from you. $200,000 would have solved all my financial problems. The irony was perfect. Ian's own financial crimes, the systematic fraud he'd committed against me for years, had become the very evidence that would convict him of a crime he hadn't actually committed. Bradley thinks they might offer a plea deal, Ian continued, his voice hollow. Reckless endangerment instead of attempted murder. Probably still looking at 2 to 5 years, but better than 15 to life. That evening, Ian tried calling Clark for the 7th time since the accident. I watched from the kitchen doorway as he listened to his brother's voicemail message, then hung up without leaving another desperate plea for Clark to call him back. He won't even talk to me, Ian said, more to himself than to me. 20 years of brotherhood and he thinks I tried to kill him for money. Can you blame him? I asked quietly. The evidence is pretty convincing. Ian's head snapped up, his eyes searching my face for something he apparently didn't find. You believe them too, don't you? You think I actually tried to murder my own brother? I considered my response carefully. I think you've been capable of things I never imagined. The forged signatures, the hidden debt, the way you've treated me in front of our neighbors. Maybe attempted murder isn't such a stretch after all. The words hit him like physical blows. I could see him processing the implication that his own wife, the woman who'd stood by him for 23 years, no longer trusted him to tell the truth about anything. Wednesday brought a visit from Ian's mother, Eleanor, a steel-haired woman who'd always made it clear she considered me an inadequate match for her son. She'd driven down from Toledo specifically to discuss the family crisis, and her position was immediately apparent. I've spoken with Clark, she announced, settling into our living room with the bearing of a queen addressing her subjects. He's convinced Ian tried to kill him, and frankly, I can understand why. Ian stared at his mother in shock. You can't be serious. I'm your son. And Clark is also my son, Eleanor replied coolly. The difference is that Clark isn't facing attempted murder charges. Clark didn't forge his wife's signature on financial documents. Clark didn't create a mountain of debt and then conveniently position himself to inherit a substantial insurance payout. The family meeting deteriorated from there. Eleanor made it clear that she was supporting Clark emotionally and financially through his recovery, while Ian could expect no such assistance. You've made your bed, she told him as she prepared to leave. Now you'll have to lie in it. After she left, Ian sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Even my own mother thinks I'm guilty. Thursday morning brought the official charges. Detective Morrison called to inform us that the district attorney's office had filed formal charges of attempted murder, fraud, and forgery. Ian's arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday. This is really happening, Ian said after I'd relayed the detective's message. They're actually going to put me on trial for trying to kill Clark. That afternoon I made my own appointment with Tom Bradley. As Ian's wife, I had every right to understand the legal implications of his case, particularly given that my forged signatures had become central evidence in the prosecution's motive theory. Bradley was frank about Ian's prospects. The physical evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The financial evidence provides clear motive. And Clark's testimony about Ian's access to the vehicle and knowledge of automotive repair makes for a convincing narrative. What are his chances? I asked. Honestly, not good. The prosecution has built a solid case. Ian's best hope is probably that plea deal I mentioned to him. Friday evening, as Ian sat at our kitchen table reviewing the formal charges with the desperate intensity of a student cramming for a final exam, I made my decision. Ian, I said, setting a manila envelope beside his papers. We need to talk. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Did Bradley call? Is there new evidence? I opened the envelope and removed the divorce papers I'd had prepared 3 days earlier. I can't do this anymore, I said simply. I can't pretend to support you through a trial where you'll be testifying about your character while I know exactly what kind of man you really are. Ian stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Helen, you can't leave me now. I need you to testify on my behalf, to tell them I would never hurt Clark. But you did hurt Clark, I replied, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was saying. Maybe not with brake tampering, but you hurt him. Just like you've been hurting me for years. That's different. That's marriage. That's how relationships work when you've been together as long as we have. The casual dismissal of decades of emotional abuse, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, crystallized everything I'd been feeling since that snowy morning when he'd made me wash trucks while neighbors watched. No, Ian. That's not how relationships work. That's how abuse works. And I'm done being your victim. That weekend, word of the divorce filing spread through our small town with the speed that only truly shocking news can achieve. By Monday morning, I'd received 3 unexpected visitors. Mrs. Patterson came first, carrying a casserole and an expression of deep regret. I should have said something that day, she admitted, standing awkwardly on my front porch. It wasn't right what they did to you. I knew it then, but I didn't want to get involved. Janet Johnson followed Tuesday evening, bringing homemade cookies and a similar apology. Bob and I talked about it for weeks afterward, she said. We both felt terrible for just standing there watching. We should have spoken up. Even Jake Morrison's mother, Lisa, stopped by Wednesday afternoon. Jake told me what he saw that morning, she said. He's been asking questions about why adults would treat each other that way. I wanted to tell you that if you ever need anything at all, we're here. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same neighbors who'd gathered to watch my humiliation were now lining up to offer support and solidarity. They'd witnessed Ian's casual cruelty that February morning, and while they'd done nothing to intervene at the time, they apparently remembered exactly what they'd seen. By Thursday, the local newspaper had picked up the story. County employee charged in brother's crash, read the headline, accompanied by a photo of Ian being led into the courthouse for his arraignment. The article mentioned the divorce filing, the financial fraud, and the insurance policy that provided motive for the alleged attempted murder. Ian called me from jail after his bail hearing. Helen, please. I need you to reconsider the divorce. I need character witnesses, people who can testify that I'm not capable of attempted murder. I listened to his plea with the same patience I'd shown while scrubbing his truck in the snow, letting him exhaust himself with promises and explanations and desperate bargaining. When he finally fell silent, I spoke quietly into the phone. You didn't need to hurt Clark to prove you were capable of hurting people, Ian. You already hurt me. For 23 years you hurt me. And you did it in front of anyone who cared to watch. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Ian said, So this is my punishment? You're going to let me go to prison for something I didn't do? No, I replied. This is my freedom. What happens to you is just consequences. I hung up the phone and stood in the silence of my kitchen for several long minutes, listening to the absence of Ian's voice. Outside my new apartment window, autumn leaves drifted past in lazy spirals, marking the passage of time since that snowy February morning when everything had changed. The apartment was small, just 800 square feet compared to the sprawling house Ian and I had shared for over 2 decades, but every inch of it belonged to me. No more walking on eggshells around someone else's moods. No more measuring my words to avoid triggering an outburst. No more pretending that casual cruelty was just how marriage works. 6 months had passed since I'd walked away from that life, and this morning's newspaper had delivered the final chapter of Ian's story in stark black and white. Local man accepts plea deal in brother's crash, read the headline above a photo of Ian looking haggard and defeated as he left the courthouse. The article was brief but comprehensive. Attempted vehicular homicide reduced to reckless endangerment. 2 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. The financial fraud charges had been folded into the plea agreement. Restitution paid, case closed, marriage dissolved. I folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside, then walked to my kitchen window. The view wasn't spectacular, just a parking lot and the back of the hardware store. But it was mine to enjoy without commentary, criticism, or cruel jokes about my choice of window treatments. The doorbell rang, interrupting my quiet reflection. Through the peephole I could see Clark standing in the hallway, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. I hadn't spoken to him since that night in the hospital, Hadn't seen him since the divorce proceedings where he testified about Ian's financial desperation and history of automotive tinkering. "Helen," he said when I opened the door, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been respect. "I saw the news about the plea deal. Thought maybe we should talk." I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he favored his left side, a lingering reminder of his encounter with the drainage ditch on Highway 9. His face had healed cleanly, but there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before the accident. "Coffee?" I offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "Yeah, thanks." Clark settled into one of my new chairs. Simple, comfortable furniture I'd chosen without having to consider anyone else's preferences. "Nice place you've got here." "It suits me." I poured 2 cups and joined him at my small dining table. "How are you feeling? Physically, I mean." "Better. Physical therapy helped with the ribs. Sleeping better now that." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened between us. "Now that I know the truth." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who'd been drawn into Ian's destructive orbit finally free to assess the damage from a safe distance. "I owe you an apology," Clark said eventually. "For my part in everything. The way Ian and I treated you, especially that morning with the trucks. I knew it was wrong when it was happening, but I went along with it anyway." "You were following Ian's lead," I replied, surprised by how little anger I felt toward Clark now. "He was good at making people complicit in his cruelty. Still doesn't excuse it." Clark stared into his coffee cup. "I keep thinking about that morning, about the way you smiled while you were scrubbing those trucks. At the time I thought it meant you were okay with what was happening. But looking back, I was planning," I said simply. Even then, before I knew exactly what I was going to do, some part of me was already planning. Clark's head came up sharply. "Planning what?" I met his gaze steadily. "My escape. My freedom. My revenge, if you want to call it that." "The brake tampering," Clark said quietly. "That was you. It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. Ian created the motive, the means, and the opportunity. I just arranged things so the evidence pointed in the right direction." Clark leaned back in his chair, processing this confession. "You could have killed me." "No, I couldn't have. I'm not a murderer, Clark. I calculated exactly how much damage would be done, what kind of accident would result. Enough to bring investigators, not enough to seriously harm you. But you let Ian take the blame for something he didn't do." "Ian took the blame for something he was capable of doing," I corrected. "The financial fraud was real. The pattern of abuse was real. The fact that he'd positioned himself to benefit from your death was real. I just helped justice find its way to the right conclusion." Clark was quiet for a long time, working through the implications of what I'd told him. Finally, he asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it's over. Ian can't hurt either of us anymore, and you deserve to know the truth." I paused, considering my next words carefully. "And because I needed someone to understand that the woman who smiled while washing trucks in the snow wasn't weak or broken. She was dangerous." A slow smile spread across Clark's face. "You know what? Good for you. Ian had it coming, and we both know it. You're not going to turn me in? For what?" "Ian pled guilty to reckless endangerment. Case closed. Besides," Clark's smile widened, "I'm not exactly the victim here, am I? You saved my life by getting me away from Ian before he really did try to kill me." After Clark left, I walked through my apartment with new eyes. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every decision about how to arrange my space. All of it chosen freely without consultation or compromise. The financial settlement from the divorce had been substantial once Ian's hidden assets were discovered and liquidated. Both trucks, legally registered in my name despite Ian's forgery, had sold for enough to pay off his fraudulent debts with money left over. The irony of Clark's insurance settlement helping fund my new beginning wasn't lost on me. $25,000. Clark's decision to settle with the insurance company rather than pursue a lawsuit had covered my moving expenses and the deposit on this apartment. That afternoon, I drove through my old neighborhood, past the house where Ian and I had played out the final act of our marriage that snowy February morning. A for sale sign stood in the front yard, and I felt a strange sense of closure seeing it. Ian had been forced to sell when he couldn't make the mortgage payments without his county salary. Mrs. Patterson was working in her garden when I pulled up to the curb. She looked up, recognized me, and walked over with the careful courtesy of someone who'd learned important lessons about minding her own business. "Helen, how are you? You look wonderful." I did look wonderful, I realized. Better than I had in years. "I'm doing very well, thank you. How's the neighborhood?" "Quieter," Mrs. Patterson said diplomatically. "The new family that bought the Johnsons' place is lovely. Young couple with twin boys. Very polite." We talked for a few more minutes about inconsequential things. The weather, changes in the neighborhood, her grandson's upcoming graduation. But underneath the pleasant small talk was an acknowledgement of everything that had happened, everything we'd both witnessed and learned from. As I drove away, I caught sight of Jake Morrison, no longer a teenager but a young man now, washing his car in his parents' driveway. He looked up as I passed, raised his hand in a brief wave, and I wondered what lessons he'd carried from that February morning when he'd watched two grown men humiliate a woman for their entertainment. That evening, I sat on my small balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over a town that had reshaped itself around Ian's scandal. He'd become the cautionary tale parents told their children, the example wives cited when their husbands pushed too far, the proof that consequences could find anyone anywhere, if the right person decided to deliver them. I wasn't angry anymore. That revelation had come gradually over the past 6 months, the rage and resentment slowly dissolving as I built a life that belonged entirely to me. Ian had tried to make me small, insignificant, disposable. Instead, he'd created someone capable of patience, planning, and perfectly executed revenge. The woman who'd smiled while scrubbing trucks in the snow had been planning her escape the whole time, even if she hadn't known it yet. And now, sitting in the quiet sanctuary of her new life, she could finally appreciate the elegant symmetry of it all. People forget words, but they never forget how you made them feel. Ian had made me feel powerless for 23 years. Now he understood exactly what powerlessness felt like, and he'd have 2 years of probation to think about how he'd earned it. The neighbors who'd witnessed my humiliation that February morning had become witnesses to something else entirely, proof that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous of all. If this story of calculated revenge had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Helen calmly handed Ian those divorce papers while he begged for her support. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more jaw-dropping stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.